So in this one, we're going to be adding our static files so we can make this page look a little bit more like this page. And then our share page, so the share page looking, let's just take a look at the share page. The share page, this, looking a little bit more like this. Now, first things to note is they are very similar. Maybe at glance, they don't look very similar, but we're going to focus on this part of it right now, not the top. But we have an image on one side and then text, some more text, and then some buttons. And then, again, an image on one side, text, and some buttons. And then if we change the size, the image will drop to the bottom as well as on the other one. So changing the size will allow that to happen. Right, so that's one of the huge advantages of Bootstrap is that it's responsive like that. So what I want you to do is save these images into your project. I already went ahead and did that, so I have them saved into my virtual environment for now. So I have it as launch and iPhone. And these images can be whatever size you want, right? So look at this image, it's pretty big, and you can see the dimensions there. And then the iPhone is not as big, but it's definitely bigger than what's displayed there. Now, of course, you don't want to have too big of images. Like this one's probably a little too big, but it's compressed down pretty well. So if you look at the size here, the size is actually pretty decent. It'll load relatively quick, where this one is significantly smaller, and it's also smaller in size because the size it is will change how fast it's actually loaded for any given user around the world. All right, so now that we have that, make sure that you have a couple images, and they can be rectangle, they can be square. It doesn't really matter. You can go ahead and use the Swift for Entrepreneurs images. That's okay. Once you do that, then we will be ready for this next step. So you can go ahead and pause it now and get your images ready. Okay, so hopefully by now you have your images saved in your virtual environment, just like I have. So what we have to do is we have to set up where our static files are going to be located relative to our project. Okay, so static files meaning CSS, JavaScript, and images. These typically don't change a whole lot, and they're not necessarily related to your Django project, right? So CSS is completely separate from Django. JavaScript is completely separate from Django. Images, of course, are also completely separate from Django. Now, all of these things can work together, but they can also work independently of each other. CSS and JavaScript do not rely on a server to actually work. They rely on a web browser. And then same with images. They do need to be served at some point, right? So these actually need to be on a server to actually work on a website, but they don't require some server configuration like what Django does to actually work. So you can take courses in CSS and JavaScript separately that go into a lot more depth on how to actually use JavaScript and CSS. And then once you understand how those things work, this is how you would set up your Django project to work with those things. So there's a couple that we want to add, and the first one is static root, and I'm just going to leave it as an empty string for now. And then we will say media root, also an empty string. Get some space here, and then media URL, and I'm going to just call it media, just like static, so very similar. And then right below static root, we're going to do static files dirs. So static file directories. And what this is a tuple here. That allows us to have multiple locations of where our static files are actually going to be stored. So once we have multiple locations of where our static files are located, right? So if we have several places where we want to locate our static files, we run a function to collect all those static files into one place, which is going to be our static root. And then from there, we serve those static files to go in to the static URL, and they will be served that way. So that might be a little complicated, but we're going to go through the process here in just a moment so you can see how we actually do this. Now, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be following the same pattern as what we did with template dirs, right? So I want to actually add static as a folder exactly like this, right? So let's go ahead and in our source, I'm going to do a new folder and call it static. And within static, I'm going to do a new, not a new file, whoops, new folder again. I'm going to call it static root. And then a new folder, call it static dirs. So these are going to relate to their respective things right there. And then last but not least, I'm going to do a new folder called media. And that's going to relate there. So let's actually look at the long way of coding this, just like what we did with templates here. We're going to do it the same thing with these other ones. So let's go into our project, cancel out the server. We are going to list out everything, and we see this new folders here. So static, so cd static. Okay, list it out again, and cd static root. List it out again, nothing in there. If we do pwd, we now see this long list here. So I can copy that. And for static root, I can use this as the string with a trailing slash, just like what we did here. This is perfectly acceptable locally. We can test it out locally this way. Now, of course, if you're on Windows, if you do dir, it will show you a path very similar to this. But instead of a backslash, it'd be a forward slash like that all the way down. Okay, so that is an okay way to do it. Not the best method, but it's okay. It will work. At least locally it will work. So if I copy this and I paste it down here with a trailing comma, make sure that trailing comma is there, and then change static root, this file folder, right, to static dirs, I can do that. And that will allow it to actually set up my static files. So this is where I'm going to be adding my personal files. Like this is where I'll add my CSS, my images, all that. That's where you add it. You add it on static dirs. You don't add it to static root. It's not necessary. And again, you can have multiple locations here if it's needed for your project. It's usually not necessary as well, but you can have multiple locations to have your static files, to make sure that your static files are being collected into the static root when it's called. So I'm going to comment these out. And then the last thing, our static root is our media root, we can just copy this again and change this to media, because we just called it media here and here. All right, so that's one way to do it. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to save it, and I'm going to run python manage.py collect static. Oops. Want to make sure that we're in the root of our project. So change into LWC. So the root of our project, oops, not even there. The root of our project is where manage.py is, right? So python manage.py collect static. And it's now saying you have requested to collect static files to the destination location in your settings. So check to see that this is correct. Is this where we want it to go? Well, yes, it is. I mean, we wrote it out explicitly. We said exactly where we want it to go, so it's saying yes. I'm going to say no to cancel, because that's not how I want it to be laid out, and we'll see what that means in just a second. But that would have collected all of the files that were in here to here, and it collects other things as well. We'll see what those other things are in just a second, but it's basically going to be collecting what's ever in that file, that folder right here. So what I'm going to do is actually add some stuff into this folder. I'm going to make a new folder in here. Notice that static root is empty. Static dirs, I'm going to make a new folder in here. I'm going to call it images, but actually img for short. So static dirs now has a folder called img. So if I go back in my Finder window and I look at my static here, got static dirs and img. Perfect. Let's actually move my images that I had before over in there. So I'm going to grab them and just move them on over by just holding it down. Perfect. All right, so now they're in there. Now we can actually make some changes to the way these things are written. I'm going to comment this out, and I'm going to comment this out. I'll leave them there so you can see them later, but I'm going to leave them. I'm going to have them commented out. All right, so we're going to use this same thing, this relative path. So I'm going to copy that and paste it here. Now, if you remember, what does this path do? It looks like this. So this is where it's going to go. It goes to source and then templates. But we want to go to source, static, and then static root. So it's already going to source with the base directory. That's what the base directory does, is it takes us here. So basically, base directory gives us this full thing right here, right? And now we need static. So static is that first one. So that's going to handle that folder. And then if we put another comma and then do static root, it actually combines it and makes this whole thing. Now, you might think, oh, well, hey, I saw this online somewhere. That will work sometimes. But if you're on a Windows computer, this might fail. And vice versa. If you're on a Windows and you did this, it's going to fail on a Mac or a Linux. So we just use the single quote, and this will give us all that. That's what that command will do. So we can copy this, paste it in here, trailing comma, don't forget that, static dirs, so just like that. Okay, cool. And then last but not least is that media one. Paste this down here. Make sure that trailing comma is gone, right? Because it's not in a tuple, so the tuple needs the trailing comma, but the string, like this turns it into a string, does not. And all this needs to be is media. All right, so now we have our settings, our static files set up correctly. Everything about our static stuff is done as far as the setup of their location. So we can now run python manage.py collect static again. Before I hit enter, I want to make note of this, see where it's going. And then if we look in ours, we have it set up as this. It's no longer explicit. And we hit collect static. It says at the exact same spot. That is perfect. That's what we want to see. So we type yes to continue, and it just collected a bunch of stuff. Right? So we just see all these files, and it says copying. Notice the first one it says is iPhone and then launch. It copied all this stuff, and it moved it into static root. Now static root has some stuff for us. It has image, img, and then phone and launch, and then all this other stuff. And you should also note that admin was another one that was added. So this has to do with our Django admin. This is all of the admin type files within the static root. Now going forward, whenever you want to add something new, you just add it into static dirs, and then you collect static. And you run collect static, and that will take it into the static root, which is where it will then be served. So let's actually go ahead and test that out. Looking in our project, let's bring over our Bootstrap CSS. So I'm going to go into inspect element, and I'm going to go into the head here, and I'm going to copy this right here. So I'm going to click on it first, and now I see all this CSS stuff. This is a minified version of CSS, which just means that all the white space is gone. I'm going to save it, and I'm going to go into my project, into source, into my static, into static dirs. I'm going to make a new folder called CSS. And now I'm going to leave bootstrap.min.css. Okay, save that in there. While I'm at it, I'm going to also save the Jumbotron. So save as jumbotron.css. Okay. And now down to also the last one is bootstrap.min.js. We're going to leave the jQuery one there. That's fine. So let's copy this, the bootstrap.min.js, save as. I bring it up a folder and do JS, new folder for JS, save it. Okay, so now we have the majority of our content saved. We can leave these assets just like that, or the JavaScript just like that. That's okay. Some of these things we can just kind of get rid of, but we're just going to leave those as is now. All right, perfect. So now that we have those, we have to change our static files. So let's go into our templates now, and inside of base, we want to change these to work with our actual new static files. So what I'll do at the very top is load static files. So this is to allow us to work with our static files. So I need to load this in order to do what I'm about to do. So I'm going to comment out this other one with the HTML comment. That's how you do it. And I'm going to add in link href equals to double quotes and then static. And then we want to give the location of the static file. So it's going to be CSS bootstrap.min. So CSS slash bootstrap.min.css. And then real equals to style sheet. All right, so this is just copy. This is essentially copying this. But now that we put static, that means our server is going to be serving it instead of getbootstrap.com. So let's check it out. Going into our Chrome and doing a refresh in here. If we go to back into inspect element, looks like our CSS is running through. And what we notice here is, look, static.css or /css bootstrap.min.css. Perfect. So it's actually running, right? So that's what this does. It loads the static files and it allows us to work with our actual static files. So let's say, for instance, if I kept these two things uncommented and I did a refresh in here, this is what it'll look like. So this is without the CSS, right? And if we go into our inspect element, we will see that these are commented out. So let's try something different. I'm going to just change this to bootstrap2.min.css. Do a refresh. Still broken. But the link here works. If I click on it, it's going to say not found, right? So we got to make sure that everything's named correctly. You type everything out correctly. And this will actually load these static files correctly. So we can actually copy this and put it below the template one and change this from bootstrap.min just to jumbotron.css. All right, and I'm leaving it in CSS because if I check, my static dirs where I saved it, we can see in my static directories or static dirs that I have jumbotron.css, so this will work. Right, if it was stored in image, it would be img, but it's not stored in image. That doesn't make sense. So now that works. So back into our project, we look at it again, we refresh. We now see it says static /css, blah, blah, blah. Now, notice that first part says static, and that is coming from our settings, right? So that's coming from this. So if I just want to say main static and just refresh in here, that now changed to main static, right? So it's going to go off of whatever your settings file is. So if you wanted to change the way your static settings are, that's where you would do it, the URL for it. And you shouldn't be hard coding it in. That is writing static /CSS bootstrap.min.css. Should not be doing this. I'm going to just show you why in a second. So if we save that and I refresh it, works fine at first, right? But as soon as I go in my settings and say just static 2 and refresh it, it breaks, right? So that is part of the reason you would not do that. And just better practice to leave it by loading in the static files just like this. So keep that in mind when you're actually loading the static files. And yeah. All right, so that's loading static files, and if we go down to the JavaScript, we want to change this source. I'm going to paste in the static stuff, and instead of CSS, it's going to be JS, and it's bootstrap.js, min.js. Okay, so to make sure that I know what that is I'm just going to look in my static dirs and it says bootstrap.min.js. That's how I have it right there. It's perfect. So if for some reason you save this as a different name or you overwrote it, like you wrote, Bootstrap or something you forgot to know, then you just want to make sure that this is done correctly too. Otherwise, a lot of your JavaScript stuff might not work correctly. Now, of course, you don't actually have to know exactly how JavaScript works in order for your site to work, but you do want to make sure that it's actually coming through. Okay, so now really quickly, I'm just going to add on this home page, I'm just going to add that iPhone to our home page. So let's go ahead and open up home page. And oops, it's actually in our base. We have our base Jumbotron in here. We will have to change this at some point, but I'll actually just add it in here for now. And the next one we'll update all of the image stuff. So I'm just going to go image source equals to, remember, load static files. So static, and it's going to be single quote img, and then iPhone.png. And I'm going to add class of img responsive. Okay, so that's it. This is all you need. This class you don't actually need. This is how you'd load an image in. Adding that class allows it to change size depending on the browser size. All right, so this static img iPhone, img right here, iPhone.png, that's how I know all that stuff. It might be .jpeg or .jpg or GIF. You know, it could be all those things. That's okay. But just make sure you have the right extension and the right file name. Otherwise, it will be broken. So we save that. And let's go back into our project to do a little refresh. And there we go. We see it. It's actually coming through, right? You're wondering, hey, it's kind of big still. All right, well, let's fix it. So we're just going to change div class, column small 6. And I'm going to end that div class there. Put another one. And make sure you end it, right? So if we tab it in, we can see where our div classes are ended. And of course, if you click on any of these divs, it has an underline like open, close, open, close, open, close, open, close. Perfect. So we're not going to have any errors there. Get rid of these two p tags because we don't need them. Now, if we go back in and we refresh, perfect. It's actually starting to look more like that. So in the next one, we are going to actually clean everything up to where it will look almost identical to this and this, depending on what page you're on, of course, with the images and the rounded stuff and all that. So we will see you then.